Welcome to the New Mexico Military Museum podcast. Today we will be starting a new three-part series dedicated to the rise of Japan. And today we have the pleasure of having Aaron Krebsbach, our collections manager, visiting with us today and being able to walk us through this process. So just to give our listeners just a bit more of an understanding, would you like to go into your background, who you are, things like that?
Yep. So my name is Aaron Krebsbach. I am the collections manager here at the museum. I am responsible for the care of all of the objects, donations, and everything we get in that create our displays, as well as the interpretation of our gallery, along with our director, Larita Hewitt. I'm originally from a small place called West Bend, Wisconsin, which is just north of Milwaukee. I grew up there and I studied World War II most of my life. I went to University of Wisconsin Oshkosh for undergrad, University of Wisconsin Milwaukee for graduate school in public history and museum studies. And I continued to grow and cover a lot of the war historian stuff. I focus mainly on antebellum, pre-Civil War U.S. to just after Vietnam is the main area that I've done a lot of writing, reading, and stuff like that. So the rise of Imperial Japan and the start of World War II for the United States and the defense of the Philippines really falls within the category of stuff I've read and covered. So they trace the beginning of World War II for Japan. They tend to trace back to the Meiji Restoration. Emperor Meiji was Emperor Matsuhito, his death name being Meiji, was brought into power in the 1800s, roughly 18, I'd have to double check the dates. I think it's 1865, 1868. And so when Emperor Meiji comes to power, we see the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. We see the rise of westernization of Japan. And that's really where a lot of historians trace the lead up to World War II. If you want to trace it a little further back, you can really see it with Commodore Matthew Perry, with gunboat diplomacy showing up with the U.S. Pacific Fleet and opening up Japan. But to start with, looking at Emperor Meiji, so he comes to power with the death of his father, and his father was Emperor Kome. Emperor Kome was very, very much isolationist. He was not fond of the gunboat diplomacy that Commodore Perry put forth, and so
I don't think anyone was really fond of that except the Americans.
No, Europe was a little bit because with Japan being so isolated, Japan ended up pushing all the foreigners out of their country when they ended up becoming isolation, and the only people that were allowed to trade were the Dutch, and the Dutch were isolated to Nagasaki. They couldn't leave Nagasaki. Anybody who left Nagasaki would have been condemned to death. And so Commodore Perry shows up in July of 1853 with the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sails into Tokyo Harbor, points guns at the Imperial Palace, and basically goes, "So you're going to trade with us?" And the Japanese government was kind of like, "Well, I think that's a great idea, because it's either you trade with them or the U.S. declares war on Japan
and takes everything."
Japan doesn't have a lot of natural resources, but the major thing was silk being such a commodity, both from China as well as Japan, as well as Japanese culture. So Emperor Kome was emperor at the time of Commodore Perry showing up. He wasn't thrilled with westernization, but again, when you have a technologically advanced civilization showing up, pointing their battleships' guns at you and saying, "You're going to trade with us," and your navy is wooden boats, you're kind of forced into it.
Yeah, not a whole lot of options.
Yeah. So when Emperor Kome died and Emperor Meiji ended up becoming emperor of Japan, he ended up subscribing to the westernization. Now, for up until the Meiji Restoration, Japan was ruled by the shogunate. Since the Battle of Sekigahara, the Tokugawa shogunate had peace in Japan for hundreds of years. A few rebellions here and there, but they were put down very swiftly. And so you have the fall of the shogunate when Emperor Meiji comes to power, and with the influence of the West, the emperor is no longer a figurehead and he wants to reconsolidate his power. And then you have the Boshin War. So the Boshin War ends up being the breakdown of the samurai class. It's their last hurrah against the shogunate. a lot of American audiences, if you look at the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, that's the Boshin War. Except for the fact that it wasn't Americans that sided with the shogunate. It was actually a bunch of French guys, and Tom Cruise's character is actually based off of one of those French guys. And then you have the Imperial forces, who are bringing in all the Western guns, Western clothing. They're being trained and advised by Prussian advisors. At the time, Prussia is one of the major military powers of Europe. And so they're being advised by the Prussians, and they end up putting down the Boshin War, winning the Boshin War, and putting down the shogunate. And you see the disbanding of the samurai class, and the change of Bushido. Bushido is one of the big things that everybody thinks of when you say Japan. Bushido is, other than samurai and katana, Bushido is one of the major things that people think of. So I'm not an expert on Bushido. I just have a generalist knowledge, and that's what I'm going to try and convey. And so what is Bushido? Bushido is the way of the warrior. It is your personal honor and absolute loyalty to your daimyo, your lord, your country, your family. If you are a samurai in service to another samurai, your Bushido code is also coupled with your daimyo's Bushido code. And so it's a hierarchy emphasizing obedience to authority, preserving the honor of your family, yourself, your lord. It's an ideal. The closest thing, and the reason we get this analogy, is we have the idea of knight chivalry, the chivalry of the European knight. This comes from a book written in about 1900 called Bushido, the Soul of Japan, by Inazo Natatobe, where he paralyzes and romanticizes Bushido for foreigners to try and to get them understand. It's completely lambasted by the Japanese people. It is not considered a great representation of Bushido. It is
not accurate.
No, there's not much accuracy to it.
He was just trying to create a bestseller back home.
Basically. But where a lot of modern ideas of Bushido come through are from Zen Buddhism, which takes hold very much in Japan. Confucianism, which again has a large hold in Japan. Yamamoto Tutsumoto's Hagakure, and of course Miyamoto Musashi's Five Rings, with Musashi being considered one of the greatest swordsmen to ever lived, fought in the Battle of Sekigahara, never lost a battle. But also at the same time, he had his own form of Bushido. So things he would do would be considered thumbing his nose at Bushido, where underhanded, whereas for him, at the end of the day, he won, so his form of Bushido won out. So when we have we have the influence of the West coming in, especially with the Treaty of Kanagawa. So for a while, the West has been trying to open up Japan's isolationism. So we're kind of rewinding just a little bit from the Boshin War to Commodore Matthew Perry. So most Europeans had been expelled by the 1630s. And like I said earlier, the Dutch were kind of the last ones allowed in Nagasaki. And Commodore Perry shows up in 1853 and opens up Japan. And so we have the Boshin War happening. We have the influences of the West and Western powers. So Japan takes a look at the West, and they see the U.S. is starting to build this territorial empire. Spain has this territorial empire.
The British.
The sun never sets on the British Empire. And even to this day, they will tell you that. And so Japan sees this, and so they see that if they want to compete with Western powers, they need an empire. And what better than to take over your ancient neighbors? So for Japan, their biggest adversaries and neighbors are, you have the Korean Peninsula with the Korean Empire, you have China, the greater Northern Asian area. And so you have Japan trying to exert their influence first, and you have the first Sino-Japanese War. This is still under Emperor Meiji. And so Japan tries to exert its influence over Korea. This is 1894 to about 1895. Korea has issues with rebellion, and so the Japanese decide they're going to send troops to assist with putting down these rebellions. Now, the key thing about this is Korea never asked for this. They come in, they put down the rebellions, and then they refuse to leave, and this causes China to declare war. Chinese influence in the area has been waning since about 1876, but you see a massive resurgence of Korea is under our influence. Well, China is soundly defeated by the Japanese army. And so in this war, Japan ends up getting Liaodong Peninsula and Formosa. And so these are major areas, especially the Liaodong Peninsula. And so you have France, Germany, and Russia looking at this and decide to intervene with this treaty and take over the Liaodong Peninsula from Japan. And the Russians build Port Arthur, and it's a massive fortress. This will be important later because when we get to the Russo-Japanese War, which isn't long afterward, you have the Russians and the Japanese fighting over control of the Korean Peninsula. And so Port Arthur is this major bastion of the Russian military. And the Japanese come in and soundly defeat Tsar Nicholas II's army and navy. They take control of Port Arthur. You have a complete sound defeated of the Russian army. This is kind of a prelude to what's going to happen later on with the Russians having a harder time maintaining battle lines in the First World War. So,
and this is often referred to as the First World War, this fighting over the Korean Peninsula, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you wanted to trace where it would really be considered the First World War, I've seen a lot of people point to the 7 Years' War.
Sure.
Because you have France and Britain, their empires are fighting. They're fighting in the Americas. They're fighting in Africa. They're fighting in Asia.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could kind of point at this as another world war, but at the same time,
it's more of a regional conflict.
It's more of a regional conflict. And that we'll get into something like that with the Second World War, with the Second Sino-Japanese War, and why arguably you can call it the start of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. But because it's such a regional area, a lot of historians don't call it the start of the Second World War because it's a regional conflict that evolves into a bigger conflict.
Yeah, it's the match. It's not the actual place.
Yes. So yeah, Japan ends up winning this war. They annex Korea in 1910. They use a version of gunboat diplomacy to do it. And once again, it's capitulation to the Japanese people. So then we fast forward a little bit. Not long later, we have World War I. I mean, a lot of us know how World War I gets started. Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo along with his wife Sophie. And this intricate system of alliances and secret alliances ends up just
blowing everything up,
exploding Europe. And so the Japanese actually side with the Allies. At this time, you have Emperor Meiji's son, Yoshihito, is now emperor. Emperor Meiji dies in 1912. And so Emperor Taisho, who is Yoshihito, is ruling. Emperor Taisho has been a very sickly child. And so he's very sickly, but he still rules pretty strongly. So Japan sides with the Allies. They join the war. They seize German New Guinea and other German Pacific colonies, and they hold them and basically tell the European powers, we've got the Pacific.
Don't worry about us. Don't watch us.
Don't worry about us. But the UK, with their powerful navy, they still exert their influence. They have the fortresses of Singapore. They have all of their colonial holdings, India, and everything. So they still have an influence there, but Japan mainly controls the Pacific. The end of the war comes, and even though they seized all this territory, they're only given a fraction of it. And a lot of it goes back to the European powers. And Germany loses all of its colonial holdings, and everything gets reverted to some European power, and the Japanese kind of get the short end of the stick. And they're not thrilled about this.
Which is not a good start off to relations.
No, not at all. And the U.S. relations with Japan has been kind of up and down since Commodore Perry showed up. So the one thing that does kind of cement them together is the Japanese assist with the invasion of Siberia. So Russia pulls out of the war. You have the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, you have the White Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution. So you have the post-Tsarist regime fighting the communists. And so in Siberia, the U.S. comes in with its allies, and you have a continuation of the war. There is actually a medal given to the men who fought in this war. So when the U.S. pulls out, Japan stays. They have a larger interest in the area than the U.S. does. The U.S. still has an interest because the territory of Alaska. So we have the Aleutian Islands, which are literally directly across from Russia and Siberia.
You can see them shore to shore.
Yeah, you can literally see them shore to shore. And so the U.S. pulls out, but Japan stays. Opposition at home and the fact that it's not going very well kind of finally forces their withdrawal. And so Japan pulls out of Siberia. And after the war, Japan really emerges as a bit of a power. But then a massive recession hits the country during the beginning of Emperor Taisho's son, Emperor Hirohito, who is now referred to as Emperor Showa. Japan has death names. So Emperor Showa, or Hirohito, starts his reign, and in 1926, and the massive recession has kind of hit Japan. And then you also have the Great Kanto earthquake, which further destabilizes the area. And so this recession and this earthquake kind of paved the way for militarism and the resurgence of the samurai ideal of Bushido and the people version of Bushido, and this idea of militarism and having a major military kind of emerges. So then out of this we have the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, and they set up the Manchukuo state. They claim they're freeing the Manchu people from China, and they set up the puppet government. In 1936, they expand further, and they claim areas of Mongolia in the same way. By 1937, you see a reunited front of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong against the Japanese people. There's been a civil war going on in China. You have the communist regime led by Mao Zedong and the imperialist regime led by Chiang Kai-shek. And they're going at it heavily. It's going both ways. At one point, the communists are doing well. At one point, Chiang's forces are doing well. But with the Japanese invasion, you see them decide the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they set this aside. And it'll be this way until 1945, and then they'll be back at each other's throats.
And throughout this time, the European and American powers are playing both sides off of each other, supplying.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially because you need stuff, you need material, and China has a lot of material, especially the Manchu area. And so this is you can arguably consider the Second Sino-Japanese War as the start of World War II, because even though fighting is not going on in Europe,
it's brewing.
It's brewing. Hitler is coming to power. The Nazis are storming across Europe quietly. I mean, you have the annexation of Austria, Czechoslovakia, pushes into other areas, the retaking of Alsace and Lorraine. So things we're very familiar with. And so this is arguably the start of World War II, because even though Europe's not fighting, they're still influencing the side. A lot of them are siding with China. You have Nazi Germany eventually signing the tripartite pact with Italy and Japan. The Japanese Zero was designed by a Japanese engineer who took a lot of inspiration and ideas from Juncker and the design of his aircrafts. So we're going to back up just a touch from World War II. We're not going to push the edge of that. We're coming up on that, but we'll get that the next section.
Setting the stage a little bit.
So now we're going to shift a little more to U.S. relations in Asia. So now we see how the Japanese are doing. We'll get to their relations in just a minute, but to focus on how things are going with China. So the U.S. has been fighting with Japan for trade agreements with China. We have the Stimson Doctrine, where the U.S. states that the U.S. would not recognize any treaty or agreement between Japan and China that violates U.S. rights or agreements to which the U.S. doesn't subscribe. Kind of reminds you of the Monroe Doctrine, where the U.S. exerts all of its stuff over our hemisphere. The European empires, if they want to trade, they have to go through the U.S. in order to trade. But the colonies they currently have in North and South America, they're allowed to have. It's kind of the same idea. So the U.S. does support Chiang Kai-shek over Mao and the communists. They send a lot of aid to Chiang Kai-shek. And during the Second Sino-Japanese War, the U.S. Sends a little more than just aid. We start to send manpower.
Advisors and strategists.
Yep. So the U.S., it's So with everything brewing in Europe and the way the Japanese are acting, the U.S. President Roosevelt knows war is coming. His cabinet knows war is coming. The army knows war is coming. General Patton is preparing his tanks and preparing his men for war. He knows it's coming. MacArthur knows war is coming. He's preparing the Philippines. He is building the defenses at the Philippines and requests more manpower from the U.S. to defend the Philippines.
They're reading the writing.
Yeah, everybody knows it's coming, and so to assist China, the U.S. does kind of what we're doing in Ukraine, where you have the foreign divisions. The U.S. sends planes, metals, and men. So you have men like Gregory Boeington, who ends up becoming part of the Flying Tigers. And they're a group, they fly the P-40 Warhawk, and they're American pilots, Marine and Army Air Corps pilots, who are fighting for China as soldiers of fortune. We've seen this before in the Spanish Civil War with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, where men who fought in World War I decide that they haven't really adjusted and they still kind of need that push to fight until they go and they fight against what the heck is his name? I can't remember. But they fight in the Spanish Civil War, and they fight on the opposing side from the incumbent regime so now the U.S. relations when it comes to Japan. So this is kind of a sticking point with us helping China, but you also have the way, since Commodore Matthew Perry, it's kind of been up and down. In the early 21st century, so the Russo-Japanese War was largely negotiated in end by President Roosevelt. President Teddy Roosevelt, more specifically, because we have two President Roosevelts.
Exactly.
And so President Teddy Roosevelt actually fosters good relations with Japan. And in 1912, you have the donation of the sakura trees you see in Washington to the U.S. And in return, the U.S. sends a dogwood tree. Not my favorite. I like the sakura tree personally.
Absolutely.
If you ever get a chance, if anybody listening gets a chance, I strongly suggest, pictures don't do it justice. Seeing the bloom of the sakura across the Potomac, it's quite
nothing like it.
There's nothing like it. I strongly suggest if you get a chance, go to CC and watch, especially during April when the sakura is in full bloom. It's very lovely. But you see a rise in tensions, rise and fall in tensions leading to World War I. We do some stuff. Japan does some stuff that we don't agree with. By the end of World War I, relationships are kind of okay. Then Japan really has their designs on China, and it's a major, major tension point for us. But what eases Japanese tension a little bit is coming out of the Treaty of Versailles, the limitation of military arms, the limitation of the navies. And for Japan, being an island nation and not having a strong navy as the U.S. helps to alleviate some of that. So there's the dapper on the amount of battleships were allowed, the number of cruisers were allowed. Dreadnought type ships like the USS New Mexico, there were a bunch that were commissioned that they stopped the commissioning because of the Treaty of Versailles. And so that helps to ease tensions a little bit.
Well, it just makes things a little bit more open in terms of the playing field in Asia, because now the Japanese don't have to worry about the United States setting their eyes on the same targets that the Japanese are.
Exactly. And so, but what ends up pushing tensions a little more ends up becoming the immigration law of 1924, and that stops Japanese immigration to the U.S. It's a very, very racially driven law. At the time, we all know at the time the U.S. is a very, very racially tense nation. And so this kind of really sours relations with Japan.
Absolutely.
And so Japan, as they're building their empire, you see the invasion of Manchuria, and it's completely condemned by the U.S. under the Stimson Acts. The U.S. refuses to recognize the Manchukuo state as a nation because they knew full well it was
a puppet state.
It was a puppet state. They knew full well of it, just like Hitler sets up a puppet state in Vichy, France. Mm-hmm. And again, you don't see a recognition coming from the U.S. from that.
It's all smoke and mirrors at this point. Everyone knows what's going on.
And then the Japanese decide to push into Indochina. Now, this really puts tension not just on the U.S., but it also puts tension on British interests in the area, French interests in Indochina. And so now you have everybody having issues with Japanese aggression. And so in response, you see a complete cutoff of oil, steel, aviation fuel. In 1941, with the push towards British Malaysia, the U.S. freezes all of Japanese assets in Japan. Japan can no longer field its navy at will. Yeah, so when it comes to the lack of oil, you can't field your navy at will. And in the Pacific, that is a big thing because the Pacific is massive chains of islands. And if you can't field the navy at will, you've kind of hamstrung yourself.
Your range is limited.
Yes, absolutely. And then the freezing of assets in the U.S., it's hard to trade when you don't have stuff coming in to replace the material you're losing from war.
Absolutely.
So in the summer of 1941, they send diplomats to the U.S. to negotiate. And the negotiations go absolutely nowhere because the tension and the point of our trade with China is the major focal point, and Japan refuses to give anything on it. So we refuse to give anything on it. Now, at the same time, they're sending the olive branch. They're preparing. Mm-hmm. Admiral Yamamoto, who actually studied in the U.S., is given the order to plan an attack on the naval base of Pearl Harbor. And so Yamamoto saw it as waking a sleeping dragon, but he was given an order to prepare, so he did what he was supposed to. Now, switching to the U.S. home front. So the U.S. home front at the time, we're looking at the 30s and the early 40s. The U.S. is coming out of the Depression. FDR's New Deal, the rise of the alphabet soup, is kind of putting the U.S. economy back on track. But you see a wave of other acts because, like I said, President Roosevelt knows war is coming. So we have the signing of the first peacetime draft, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, also known as the Burke-Watson Act. All males between the ages of 21 and 35 are required to submit themselves to the draft for 12 months service, 12 months active service, 10 years reserve.
He's preparing the population for war.
Preparing the population for war, absolutely. And so where are they going to serve? They're going to serve in the Western Hemisphere or any U.S. holdings or territories. I mean, you can read that as colonies. We basically built an empire. Between the Spanish-American War and World War I, we have the insurrection in the Philippines, mm-hmm. which you have a massive change in the Filipino view of the U.S. because we take the Philippines from Spain. The Philippines ends up becoming a focal point of U.S. power in Asia, especially in the Pacific. And so the U.S. has been supporting its allies. We've been sending scrap metal to Britain to build planes. We've been sending oil and anything we can get to help support our allies because we know we're eventually going to go to war, but they're fighting right now. So with the buildup of the Philippines, we see the creation of MacArthur's Philippines. So MacArthur is the son of Arthur MacArthur, who is a Civil War veteran, led the 24th Wisconsin, he lived in Wisconsin for a little bit. Where his mansion actually is currently where one of the Union Halls of Marquette University's campus is. But he was a career military. Douglas MacArthur served in World War I on the front lines, and he ended up becoming a general. And then he was sent to the Philippines under the Filipino president and helped prepare things for war. But focusing on the home front here in New Mexico, we have our own build up to this war. And we have the training and the reorganization of the 200th Coast Artillery, our home division. So after the First World War, we have the restructure of the National Guard. You have the 1st New Mexico Infantry Division is restructured into machine gun battalions, support battalions, and MP brigades. And these machine gun battalions are restructured into the 111th Cavalry. The Army learned the lessons of World War I very well. All armies learned the lessons of World War I very well. Most of the Geneva Convention comes out of World War One and things that were done in World War One, from the limitation of what types of gases can be used, which is epitome of basically none. The protection of medics, the reason that we can't weaponize basically food, especially because that comes out of what Canada did, mixing grenades with food and throwing it towards the Germans. But the Army, the biggest lesson you learned was a horse versus a machine gun, the machine gun wins.
Every time.
Every time. A horse versus modern artillery, the modern artillery wins. Every time.
Power, range, and effectiveness have skyrocketed since the Civil War.
Yep. And so the cavalry is no longer, the horse-borne cavalry is no longer viable. And the 111th is told, you have to change to something else. So they all gather, and they let them have the decision, which is very rare in the Army. Usually you're told, you're changing to this, you don't have a choice.
Live with it.
Live with it. But back then they were strict, but also there were a little more freedoms. And so they were given the choice. And plus the New Mexico, they had been cavalry for years, except for when they got changed slightly to the machine gun units. They were pulled from their horses and born machine gun units, and then switched back to the cavalry. So they come together and they decide on Coast Artillery. And so they're christened the 200th Coast Artillery. So with the Burke-Wadsworth Act of 1940, the 200th is put into active service in 1941, and they're sent to Fort Bliss for training. The draft helps them fill out the ranks with New Mexico soldiers. People like Thomas Vernon Long, who we are currently covering in our display at the Bataan building, are drafted into the Army. And so they end up getting filled out. The draft also helps to fill out from regions around New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, El Paso. They help to fill out so that the 200th ends up becoming 1,816 men strong. They are now a full Coast Artillery unit. But the problem is they're anti-aircraft, and they're using anti-aircraft guns just after World War I. They don't have the ceiling to hit how high bombers can now fly, how high fighters can now fly. But if a fighter comes in for a strafing run, they're going to get hit. But again, it's our anti-aircraft at the time. It's set for more.
It was ancient
technology. It's set for more of mono-biplane, wooden canvas. Picture the Red Barons triplane.
They're not going up against the Luftwaffe.
Exactly. So the 200th is trained, and they're prepared for war. And you have there's a competition held at Fort Bliss against all other units: National Guard, who are Coast Artillery and anti-aircraft, regular Army artillery, and the 200th outperforms them all. Speed, accuracy, everything. They come out on top. And they win this competition ahead of everything else. And there were some generals who were a little upset about this.
Of course.
Because there's the belief that and there's still kind of a belief that the regular Army is better than the National Guard.
Not in every aspect.
I'm not going to dig into that beef. That is their beef to have. I am not a person to say anything about that. So the decision comes as to where they're going to deploy them. So it's guaranteed deployment. So they end up being sent to the Philippines. Now there's some myth and legend that comes around this. The follow-up, the people that were behind them was the 206 Coast Artillery from Arkansas. And there was supposedly back and forth as to where these two were going to deploy. And so the belief is that there was a coin flip between the two commanders to decide who gets to choose. Supposedly it was a nickel, and that is why the 206 in Arkansas, they have the saying of "to the nickel," is because the nickel was flipped. It was called, the 200th won, and they chose the Philippines. The other thought is also because the majority of the 200th was bilingual. They could speak Spanish and English, which when you're being deployed to a region that speaks mainly Spanish, it's kind of important to know how to speak the populace's language.
Or at least a version of it.
That being said, the Philippines also was considered the Pearl of the Orient. It was an ideal position. Privates were allowed to have basically cabin boys who would shine their shoes, do their laundry. So, I mean, guys who usually aren't getting paid as high as like a colonel, or even if you go to a sergeant, they can still afford to have these people
Work
do their chores. And so the Philippines was considered ideal. I mean, yes, the Philippines has their rainy season and their really hot season. We see in letters from soldiers who shipped out from the 200th, like Eric Lujan and Private Long, who talk about how it's hot at the height of the day, but it usually cools off pretty well, and the humidity is tolerable at those points. And so you see them telling their families, it's like, it's okay, everything here is nice, we'll be fine. So the 200th gets decided to get sent to the Philippines. So they do a training tour of New Mexico. They tour all of New Mexico. They're wined, dined, toasted, and they end up returning to Fort Bliss, arming, and they ship out for San Francisco Bay. They end up going through a lot of New Mexico because in order to get to San Francisco Bay from Fort Bliss, you have to go through New Mexico, you have to go through Arizona, and then you reach San Francisco Bay. Most of the grunts didn't know where they were going. They just knew they were being shipped out. Because from San Francisco Bay, you can take a ship and you can head up to the Aleutians. I mean, it's a long trek that way, but you can. You can do it. Or you can take it to Hawaii and then the Philippines. Most of them didn't know. There's an argument as to whether or not the commanding officer, Colonel Sage, knew or not. When you're that high up, it's difficult to say that they couldn't have known. But it's a strong possibility that Colonel Sage knew where the 200th was going. So they board the USS President Pierce and the USS Calvin Coolidge, and they ship out. They stop in Hawaii for a little bit, but they're not allowed to leave the ship, which for a lot of the guys was kind of a downer. I personally have never been to Hawaii. Seen a lot of pictures. Have some family. I have some family who've been to Hawaii, and they say it's very beautiful.
So, not exactly a stop you want to miss.
Exactly. Even back then and even today. And so they refuel and they resupply in Hawaii, arriving in the Philippines in late August, early September. Now they're on two separate ships that leave. I don't remember if it's a couple hours apart or about half a day apart, but there's significant difference because the President Pierce ends up in a storm at sea and the Calvin Coolidge doesn't. So there is some distance between the two. And so they get to the Philippines in late August, early September.
Just months before the Pearl Harbor attacks.
Months before Pearl Harbor. And so they're stationed at Fort Stoutenburg, and they are tasked with the defense of Clark Field. Clark Field is a major airfield in the Philippines at the time, and it is their job to defend it. And that is where the 200th will sit until December 7th, 1941. As President Roosevelt said, the date that lives in infamy. And that is where the Second World War will kick off for the United States.
Absolutely, and thank you for being able to lay that foundation for us today. That will conclude the first part in this three-part series concerning the overall picture leading up to and during World War II and how New Mexico specifically ties into all that. So thank you for being with us today.
Yep, thank you.